on the state of depackaging regulations in the United States. To get us started, I'd like to welcome my colleague Nora Goldstein, who's the editor, chairperson, and principal for BioCycle, to walk us through a primer on mechanical depackaging and to share the results of our research, which we did with NRDC. Nora, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Paula, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, all. Before we get into the panel discussion, just want to present, as Paula mentioned, an overview of the research we conducted on state regulation of food waste, mechanical food waste depackaging facilities and operations. Moment. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. There was a bit of a delay. So really to set the stage, what are we talking about when we talk about mechanical depackaging? And essentially it is what it sounds like. It's the process to separate food contents from the packaging, and how it works is its variations on applied force, sometimes shearing, hammering, pressure through a metal sieve or a screen, or some combination thereof. Newer models and older models that you have to tweak a fair amount, designed for less force with some fine adjustments. And what that enables is perhaps minimizing the shattering of plastics that are harder plastics. And it's important to note that food waste depackaging manufacturers often claim that the processed slurry is greater than 95% to 99+% clean, pure food waste. It's for some reason it's really slow in moving. My slides are not letting me.
I'm still seeing the slide. What is mechanical depackaging?
Yeah, hang on, let me just, I seem to be locked up. I'm just going to stop sharing, and my apologies. Let's try that again. There we go. So as the old saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And in this instance, it's demonstrating the process that typically happens at these facilities. An incoming load of packaged food waste and gets unloaded into a hopper. In this instance, in this facility is in Sunnyvale, California. An auger, mechanical auger, feeds the packages of food waste and loose food waste onto a walking floor, which is right here. The auger helps to break open bags and whatnot. The walking floor feeds into this depackager. And what happens is very simple. You get a stream of residue and a stream of a slurry, and it's the slurry that is what is further composted or digested. Okay. There we go. So we've seen a lot of rapid adoption of food waste depackaging over the last, 5-ish years, and it definitely is accelerating. And it's really for economic and policy reasons that we've observed from a processing facility standpoint, the ability to take in packaged food waste increases with, so you're getting more food waste flow, more tip fees. In some instances, it's used to remove contamination, larger scale contamination from source separated organics. And for digesters, especially those co-digesting with manure or biosolids, it boosts the biogas volume by adding this slurry. For the waste generators, it's total economics. It especially if they're in a state where they have to comply with a landfill diversion policy for food waste, or they have a corporate climate commitment, not having to physically by hand remove the food from the packaging definitely saves on labor and retraining costs. The services being offered are typically bundled with collection and depackaging. And so it's only one contract. And again, it just makes it easier to comply. In terms of food waste diversion goals, For sure, it helps states meet the mandates they've set to keep food waste out of the landfill. As I noted, supports climate commitments, and in general, you just have more food waste flow. So the research we did with NRDC last fall and into the spring, NRDC selected 24 states for BioCycle to look into. And those are the states highlighted in pinkish on the slide on the right. We ended up, Juliana Beecher and I ended up speaking with 23 states. We had a series of questions. And what we found is two states in active rulemaking and one state laying the groundwork. Those states happen to be the ones who are on our panel today. And the core areas were just what is the level of regulatory oversight of food waste depackaging and the physical contaminant limits. So our findings in a nutshell, I'd say the biggest one is that the lack of a standardized measurement protocol for measuring smaller particles of microplastic size in the resulting slurry or the compost or digestate made from it makes it a big challenge to set limits. As far as the facilities themselves, if they're standalone, they tend to be regulated as a materials recycling facility, a transfer facility, or an intermediate pre-processing facility. And those located with a digester or a composting facility tend to just be part of that facility's permits. In terms of contaminant limits, most states have limits for compost of physical contaminants, and sometimes it applies to digestate, but rarely in coming food waste streams or slurries. Microplastic particles that are 5 millimeters or less, are microplastics. So some states have a particle size limit of 4 millimeters, which may restrict the largest types of microplastics. And in terms of next steps, it's really to support a standardized measurement protocol development for microplastics in recycled organics, slurries, compost, digestate, and to start tracking these installations, especially in states where there isn't any oversight, but maybe use a notification tier. Really important, and this is especially important in terms of developing a measurement protocol, is to sample depackaged food waste slurries to establish data on contamination levels that the whole regulatory community can track and be aware of. And finally, and very important, is to be aware of the impacts on source separated food waste composting infrastructure, especially for facilities not installing depackagers. And with that, Paula's going to take over and then we'll end the slideshow.
Thank you, Nora. We wanted to share a quick glimpse into where our research with NRDC netted out. I think the bottom line is listed here on the screen, and I won't go into reading each one, but I wanted to sit with these points for a moment because I think it really frames up the conversation that we're about to have really nicely. I think mechanical food waste packaging is here. The equipment is being installed at composting facilities. It's being installed at anaerobic digesters and transfer stations and by various different operators that are offering services to manage food waste from waste generators. That's not likely going to fully reverse anytime soon. And so the question that our report raises, or one of them, and the question that this panel is here to explore today, is not necessarily whether depackaging should exist. It's the question here is under what conditions should it scale and with what guardrails? We'll be talking about contamination limits, measurement protocols or lack thereof, permitting pathways, and probably equally as important, what is the role that source separation still plays in the context of organics diversion? And we'll ask these questions not because the end goal is depackaging itself. I would wager the 100+ people that are on today's webinar are doing this work or connected to this work because they want to see resilient and regional organics recycling infrastructure being built in ways that turns organic waste into high value, high quality products, whether that's compost or digestate with sustainable end markets that the soils ultimately benefit from. And we're not in the business of creating new problems while trying to solve old ones. So the QR link to our report is right there on the screen. Scan it. You can also find this report on our website as well. But let's turn over to the folks that are doing this work. Um, I'll go through brief introductions before we jump into the discussion today. Joining us today are three state regulators who are in the midst of writing their state's rule books as we speak, and alongside with the legendary Nora Goldstein, who, as I mentioned at the top of the call, is serving as editorial chairperson and consulting principal. She was a co-author of this report alongside Juliana Beecher. Today, we also have Lauren Hill, who is with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. North Carolina is in an interesting spot in its sort of regulatory development, and Lauren and her team are actively developing a regulatory framework for how facilities should be getting set up or just sort of announcing their presence in the state. Ben Gauthier joins us from the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. Vermont is the state that's probably furthest along with its depackaging specific regulations, and it's taking a distinctive path, leaning into source separation and manual pre-sorting rather than defaulting to mechanical processing. And last but not least is Dawn Marie Maurer, who is the solid waste facility specialist at the Washington State Department of Ecology. Washington released its most recent draft rule a few weeks ago, and it went into a notably different direction than Vermont, prioritizing pre-processing as a central tool for managing contamination. And with that, I want to kick us off maybe just to set the stage and provide a little bit more context for the regulatory frameworks that are set up in each of your states. Don, Ben, Lauren, what prompted your states to initiate creation of a regulatory framework for mechanical depackaging? Popcorn style,
I
whoever
can
wants to go first.
I can start. We Washington State had legislation a couple of years ago that mandated we open our solid waste regulations, and all composting and organic management are under our general solid waste regulations. And it mandated that my agency engage in rulemaking specifically to address contamination in incoming feedstocks, food waste feedstocks specifically, and finished products. And so while that was not a specific mandate for addressing depackaging and other forms of pre-processing, that was going to be a primary focus of the work that we did.
In Vermont, we had issued a policy back in 2019 regarding an interpretation of our statutes for source separated organics because our statutes didn't contemplate depackaging. So DEC basically issued a policy that allowed commingling of source separated and packaged organics. There's a little bit of pushback from some of the regulated community and the organics management folks. And so they brought it to legislature, and legislature actually tasked us with several things, one of which was implementing a moratorium on new depackagers until we implemented rules. So that's kind of where we found ourselves. But that legislation also required a depackaging stakeholder group process that we managed, and several other reports that we had to furnish to legislature.
Here in North Carolina, we've just begun our rulemaking process, which is something that's going to take a couple of years to complete entirely. And so we opted to develop um, a notification style form in a way of keeping track of the facilities now, So while we're waiting on the ultimate rulemaking and what guardrails we're able to put in place, we can start getting a sense of where are those facilities, what are they doing, what kinds of material are they processing, so that way when we have a set of rules in place a couple of years from now, we'll be able to launch those facilities right into those existing regulations.
Thank you. And I love that you're all sort of in different stages of your development. From Can you describe the general framework that your state has landed on for regulating depackaging as a pre-processing step for food waste and why?
I can go first. So we sort of leaned into, well, I mentioned the stakeholder group process. We took the recommendations from the stakeholders that was in the report that they provided to us, and we wrapped those into rule. And we decided to lean into our existing standing source separation statutes. And so the baseline requirement is essentially to source separate everything. And then we basically allowed an alternative that if you don't want to source separate everything, you can outsource the packaged food component to a depackager. So that's kind of how we drafted the current draft rules, and sort of what we're anticipating is bolstering or sort of reinforcing the source separation requirements, but allowing an out for larger generators of packaged food to not have to open, pallets and pallets of packaged food, but to outsource that to depackaging. So that's the short summary of our roles, and I'll turn it over.
Lauren or Donry, please.
So in Washington State, we are in the midst of moving into statutory requirements similar to California, but a little bit different for collection of organics across our state based upon population and different dates as it staggers in. So again, similar to California, there is going to be an enormous growth in the organics that are legally required to be either that a service has to be provided for, whether it is used. It is not actually a landfill ban, but it is a mandate for service to collect these organics. We have already a very, very established infrastructure for yard debris and, in some cases, commingled food waste and yard debris collection for composting in our state. We have, 1 million tons that are already being collected of different materials. And we recognize that with this new mandate, one, we don't have enough infrastructure. And so we are seeing a lot of interest in growth in processing capabilities. And because of our mandate, we're going to see generators that have materials that have been a little more marginalized required to be collected and processed, or at least, again, the requirement for a collection service. So we recognize that there's going to be this enormous growth in collection and pressures on the kinds of materials that we anticipate being collected. And so for our state, we felt like the best way to address that was to have clear standards that are similar to a material recovery facility, where it says, if you are going to manage these materials in order to get them clean enough for a manufacturer, a composter, an anaerobic digester, a vermiculturist, to be able to manage those materials, that pre-processing step, we chose to be agnostic about what kind of technology or other systems you're going to use. So for us, we decided that we were going to put that limit on how contaminated the material could be when it got to those manufacturers like a composter who makes a finished end product for sale, and that we were going to regulate the depackagers and any other form of preprocessors with the requirement that they had to be able to create a feedstock that could meet those standards when it reached our end user or our manufacturers that create that final end product. So that was the direction that we went.
For North Carolina, under the notification style approach before we have a regulatory framework in place, we've elected to regulate the depackaging as a part of the operations for an existing permitted compost facility. And we ask for this notification under one of our general statutes for recovered material. And it's a relatively short statute, and one of the options, or I guess one of the requirements, allows us to ask for documentation that they're in compliance with like a general environmental protection and as well as public health. And so we're able to ask for that notification as that general documentation.
Thank you to you all for setting up sort of the foundation of our understanding of the different regulatory environments in your states. I mentioned this in the chat, but forgot to mention it in my voiceover. I've seen a couple of questions coming through in the question and answer for folks that want to have or that have questions for our panelists. Please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We'll be answering them in the last 15 minutes of our call. And the chat function should also be available for those on this call. So with that, maybe a question for Nora, since you and Juliana have looked into this space for the better part of a year, and then I'll transition to our panelists next. From your perspective, is mechanical depackaging a tool to increase diversion from food waste? Of food waste from disposal, a critical tool for removing contamination from incoming food waste streams, or is it something else?
So I would say it is not a critical tool for removing contamination. In other words, not a pallet of packaged noodles, but just contamination that gets into the organic stream through a source separation process. I don't think it's a critical tool for that kind of source separation ahead of processing. I think for packaged food waste streams, that otherwise would be costly and perhaps, just challenging to separate by hand or with minor amounts of labor. Definitely, I think there's a role for depackaging. The direction that our report went is that it's a step Vermont is taking, I think, Ben, still, but correct me if I'm wrong, where you want to unpack the packages. So to the extent that you can remove the shrink wrap and you can salvage the cardboard, and so that what you're putting in the depackager is literally the packaged food, and then you're optimizing for recycling of the packaging, because once it's all mixed together, if it's at all recyclable, it's a very low grade mixed plastic bale, for example. So that's kind of where I feel I've landed and BioCycle has landed in this process of research and our takeaways. And I don't know if Juliana wants to add to that.
You covered it, Nora. Well said.
I may ask like a two-part question to our panelists because Nora's kicked us off by saying, in her view, not a critical tool for in all instances. So maybe the two-part question is, from your perspective, is mechanical depackaging of food waste a critical tool for food waste diversion? And then If it is, like, what are we trading off?
I can kick us off. So I think that mechanical depackaging of food waste does serve as a critical tool to increase diversion of food waste from disposal, as long as we've already made the assumption that the large food waste producers either cannot afford or choose not to invest in the time and money to source separate or in the resources to figure out how they can produce less food waste. And in this case, depackaging enables the diversion of food waste from landfills. If we were to spend some more time on that assumption, we would need to consider the placement of depackaging on the zero waste hierarchy. And that would lead us to a second assumption here of wasted food as inevitable in our communities. And if we were to spend some time questioning that assumption, that would lead us to consider the potential for depackaging to enable wasted food before it's able to enable the recovery of that wasted food. Um, at this time, the Division of Waste Management in North Carolina has accepted these kind of base assumptions of wasted food. We allow maybe more questioning and debate for that to come from the public that we serve. And we usually see that reflected in the way that they choose to align their facilities within that zero waste hierarchy. But it's in our position as a regulating body to support a diverse set of food waste solutions. Um, Not necessarily saying that one is better than the other, but helping to not put all of our eggs in one basket. Um, and I guess the second part to your question was the trade-off there. And I think that the the trade-off is in the contamination. Whether you're accepting contamination in the form of microplastics or in the contamination of what the depackaging is able to prevent and take out, then that's something that I don't think we can make a fair determination on without the testing process for microplastics.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would. Oh, go ahead, Ben.
Okay. Sorry, Don. Yeah, I think I agree with Lauren. I think from Vermont's perspective, we certainly see depackaging as critical in the food waste recycling infrastructure. Um, we currently only have one depackaging facility in Vermont, so we're talking about a pretty small world compared to other states that probably have multiple. Um, And so yeah, I mean, we sort of saw the trade-offs of what the world looked like before depackaging because we had source separation requirements. And prior to the construction of the depackager in Vermont, we were allowing disposal of the packaged food component for large generators that just didn't have the time or the staff or the economics to pay people to open each thing, which felt, overly onerous. So we were allowing that to be disposed. So we sort of saw the best and worst case scenarios, which is sort of how we've landed on, the current draft rule setup of everything's going to be source separated. If you can source separate the packaged stuff, awesome. Then you just got one stream to manage. If that's too much for you, you can send the packaged food to depackaging, and then we'll work with that on the tail end of anaerobic digestion generally in Vermont. It's where the bulk of it goes. And so that's kind of where we've landed with it. But yeah, we certainly encourage it, and we've been working closely with our depackager in state to do, as Nora alluded to, as much manual pre-processing ahead of time, both to recover recyclables, but also to reduce the amount of things that can get broken into smaller fragments and make it into the slurry. And they're doing a great job of doing that. So we've had tremendous success with just that simple measure.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree that we're kind of in similar positions. From Washington's standpoint, it is a tool, and whether that tool is critical or not depends upon your goals. So we do not have a landfill ban of organics. We have a statutory requirement for increasing collection services. And what we have found is that there's going to be a trade-off in costs. So there are materials that are not going to be capturable without some kind of pre-processing. And we have found that vast quantities of food waste are going from distribution centers directly into landfill, that are going from a lot of other large scale generators directly into landfill, because the economics of managing those materials to separate them in such a way that they can reach a composter are not economics that those companies are able to adapt and stay within their profit margins. So absolutely, there are a wide variety of different ways that this could be addressed. And if there were economic drivers that pushed for other kinds of management of these materials in order to get them into systems without going through mechanical depackaging, then we might see more interest in that. But that is going to increase the cost of food. It's going to increase the cost of management of all of these systems. And we're not seeing at this time in my state a society that's ready to go in that direction. Could that change in the future? It could. But at this time, we're trying to be realistic about our ability to capture certain streams. And at this time, depackaging is allowing materials that are currently going to landfill to have another option from these large generators.
Paula, could I just jump in? Because there's something that I didn't say that I think is important to the discussion. Anecdotally, we've asked companies or grocery stores or others, does this convenience of depackaging minimize the ability to donate? And in each instance, for example, the New York State Organic Summit had a conversation, and they don't see that convenience. The donation happens ahead of this point in their processes. So I just want to, but that's just anecdotal. We haven't done research to see if there's any suppression of it's too convenient. But I just think it's important to say that during the session.
I agree, Nora. I actually raised my hand because I wanted to sort of add something to my earlier statement about in Vermont we have organics management hierarchy, and I think in a perfect world, if I could slide all the pieces to the perfect place, all that food would go to human consumption and to be eaten or to donation. So I would, probably try to emphasize programs to move things at the last minute, either super discounted or whatever, to get them off the shelves and sold and eaten, versus having to send things to depackaging. But you can't avoid some amount of, contamination in the product that has to go to depackaging. There's always scenarios. So I think the moving it off the shelf to human consumption and the donation piece is underutilized in most systems.
In the interest of time, because I definitely want to leave enough room for questions from the audience, I have a question for our regulators a little bit further down the path. But for Dawn Marie and Ben, would you say that there are key themes that have come up in the public meetings that you've hosted, in the public comment periods about your state's draft rules on mechanical depackaging? I wonder if those comments have influenced the approaches that you've taken in later drafts of the regulation, and in the promulgation of the final rule.
Absolutely. We looked hard at comments that came through and considered them when we moved to our final draft that has just come through for public comment. We are not complete with our rulemaking, and so we will have to see if any of the comments that have come through are going to make additional changes. The primary change that we made was actually, I would say, a step down on environmental protection in some ways, in that we heard strongly from our composting community that they still wanted to be able to manage organics with a higher level of contamination than we were planning to restrict as an incoming feedstock. So whether it's anaerobic digestion or composting or other forms, we had initially proposed a 2% contamination by volume for incoming contamination to those facilities that create that final product. And our rulemaking is currently proposing a 5% because of pushback there. So interestingly enough, the changes that we made were not a ratcheting down based upon our comments. It was actually increasing that contamination limit going to those end users, with the assumption that what they're telling us is that they have other ways that they can manage that contamination at the back end. So that's what we came up with in Washington.
Yeah, and we, as I mentioned before, we had a policy that allowed commingling of source separated and packaged food, initially issued in 2019, and then we had the depackager stakeholder group process, which was a public process with at least 10 meetings, I believe. And then we did a voluntary public process for our draft rules for the organics. So we just sent them out to everybody that was interested and had a precursory look at them before we started filing through the formal process in Vermont, which had its own public comment period. So we've actually been through 3 processes to get these depackager rules to where they're at. So we've been listening to people along the way. I think the trouble with this issue, and I think why a lot of states grapple with it, is because I don't think there's a sweet spot that exists that pleases everybody. Like it's sort of like you got to thread the needle and find the way, but it's like someone on the fringes is going to be unhappy with where you land no matter what, it feels like. And so we've been trying to iron those wrinkles out along the process. But it's difficult to do.
Yeah, and maybe a question for Lauren. There are other states like Washington and Vermont that have gone through the process. Like, what are your lessons or takeaways from seeing other states develop their regulation frameworks that you're taking into consideration for North Carolina?
I think the way that Vermont has run some of their stakeholder groups is something that we'd like to be able to model when we go through our own rulemaking process. I think that, again, as a regulatory agency, the most important thing that we can be doing is representing the people that are our composters and the anaerobic digestion facilities that are using this technology. So making sure that we're able to sit all those people down at one table and figure out what everyone's questions and concerns are, and making sure that we're addressing them. Um, and I also really like the idea of optimizing recycling and figuring out um, how we can use the optimizing recycling as one of the guardrails while some of the national testing protocols aren't in place yet. So if that can be a way of sliding us into some kind of a zero waste hierarchy within our regulations, I think that that can be key for not opening the floodgates entirely and then trying to close them once it's everywhere.
Mhm. Donna Marie, you mentioned earlier, like for now, depackaging is a tool in your state, and I think what were implied in several of the panelists' responses is that like allowing for flexibility for things to change and evolve. I'm wondering from your perspective, this is a question for all, like how can regulations be written with that level of flexibility to allow agencies to revisit and tighten standards sort of in the absence of measurement tools or data around slurry contamination, rather than being written in a way that locks infrastructure up in like one particular solution.
Well, in part, that's a challenge for how state regulations work, or agency regulations work. So, in the case of Washington State, our solid waste handling regulations can be reopened essentially at any time. That's unlikely to happen. We don't have to have a statutory mandate in order to open up the solid waste handling regulations. It is tremendously expensive to the state. And so we do try to be cognizant of the fact that we are spending public dollars every time we open a rule. And so there are pressures to only open it when we need to, but we don't have a restriction on how often we can open our rule. Absolutely, if there was legislation that pushed us to open it, that would happen whenever the legislation mandated that we had a rule update. Otherwise, we do periodically try to open our rule as conditions changed. And if we found that there was some national level data that suggested we could be significantly more protective of human health and the environment through making changes, that would be a strong driver. But as far as like how that works, that really comes down to the framework that your state or your agency has for rulemaking.
And I would say it's always easier to open things up to be less restrictive than it is to make them more restrictive. So starting with sort of a precautionary approach, just because there's a lot of unknowns, right? A lot of the packaging materials that are used, that particularly those that are not in food contact, they're not designed to be in contact with food. So there's been no studies, there's no guarantees with what could be in them. And so there's just a lot of unknowns of what happens to that through the depackaging process, what happens to that through digestion and land application. We don't know, and we can't monitor or sample for that yet. So I think my recommendation would be to start off overly strict from an environmental protection standpoint. Do as much pre-processing as you can, do as much food donation as you can, depackage as little as possible. I mean, I guess we assume there's going to be some impact, otherwise there wouldn't be a permit required, right? Like there's assumption of some impact from the process and the land application of the materials. But it's easier to be less stringent as you learn more about the process and the characteristics of the digestates or the slurries than it is to shut the gate valve off, would be my quick thoughts on it.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing before we jump into Q&A. There are a couple spots in the North Carolina 1400 composting rules where we've added in a little bit of a gray area where the way that the rules are written opens up for additional testing or documentation required from facilities if it is deemed necessary for protection of public health and the environment. An example of where that might come up is something like buffers or setbacks. Possibly if a site is like really having a hard time with odors, something like an increased setback would be a way to address that. And so I think if there's any way to write in at least a little bit of wiggle room to anticipate some of those problems that might arise later, that where you don't have time to go through a full rulemaking process to address.
Yeah, I would like to add to what's been said. That's where this, I think it's really important to do sampling of slurries to really build up the data. And I know when we had the call to organize the webinar and speak with Don Marie and Ben and Lauren, that we talked about, is there state funding or any way to cover some of those sampling costs? And I think, but there's, and I'm going to say this, I think there's a reluctance because of all the unknowns on the part of depackaging operators to just volunteer to have slurry tested if it's not required. And so I think that's talk about needles to thread. I think that has to be, because I think at the end of the day, without that information, it's going to be blind. So I just wanted to add that bit of color. And there's always ways to anonymize data sets, because what we're really after is the presence. And then there's the challenge of, well, what tests will you use? And happy to take that offline, in the research we've done.
And this is one of the questions as we transition to Q&A that came up in the panel or of questions that were submitted. But I'm curious to hear from our regulators, like, is there a way for the rulemaking process to be designed in a way to support data collection and drive that visibility before rules are established?
Potentially, you mean like stand up like some sort of sampling regime to gather information? I think it's possible. I think the obstacles right now are these materials are so heterogeneous that it's difficult to get any meaningful samples without a lot of numbers. Like the N has to be really high to be able to get any meaningful data from it. And secondarily, just the difficulties of the sampling methods now. Just real quick, UVM here in Vermont, University of Vermont did some research on this, and they did a really long process that was very labor intensive. Took I think it was over 30 or 40 days to do each sample. And they had to run things in triplicate and average them in terms of particle counts of plastics because they were so varied, even within a small, dish that they were looking at, that's only a couple inches across. So there's a lot of difficulties in the sampling that need to be worked out too, not just the methodology of how to analyze a sample and get it accurately and repeatable, but also like how many samples do you need across this very, very varied material to get any meaningful results. It's a pretty big task, very expensive for sure.
This is something that was discussed on a recent webinar. I want to say it was US Composting Council that was talking about PFAS sampling for compost specifically. And someone that was working on a lot of the sampling methodology was talking about how important it is to figure out your why for why you're sampling and not necessarily testing just for the sake of testing, especially for that cost factor. And so I think that if we were able to get some preliminary testing in the regulations, we would need to be really explicit on what that purpose for testing was.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. I'm going to begin to ask some or read off some questions that came in through the Q&A. What are the rules for use of plastic bags in source separated organic collection programs within each of your respective states? Are there requirements to use compostable plastic bags? And does this reduce the dependency on depackaging to remove plastic bags?
Well, Vermont doesn't have any requirements or prohibitions on compostable plastic bag liners. We leave it up to the facility that's managing the organics to make that decision. Some of them have gotten away from them altogether. Some of them embrace them just because the generators seem to prefer them. But I think what we've seen, this is anecdotal, I don't think we have any data to back it up, is the plastic bag liners tend to mask other contaminants that could be in there. It's harder to see when it's in a bag versus when everything is visible. So it can create some other cascading problems, but it is cleaner for the generator. So people tend to embrace it.
Mhm.
Washington,
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say Washington State does not have any requirements for or against. Usually collection requirements are set up in combination of if it's residential, that's going to be through the municipality or county local government creating conditions for what materials are going to be collected residentially, and where they're going to go, and then additionally with the hauler requirements. But we don't usually see compostable liners. We usually see most of our organics go unbagged. On the other hand, we don't have a specific restriction one way or the other. And when we're moving into commercial, for the majority, we do not see collection companies allowing bags, but that's up to them. We don't have a restriction. Washington does have some other restrictions on plastic bags in general, but I won't go into those.
Yeah, we don't have any restrictions for the compostable bags or not arriving at facilities. That would be up to the individual facility on whether or not they want to take those BPI certified plastics.
I'm wondering, I'm paraphrasing this question, but I'm wondering to the extent your states have um, done the cost analysis of the increase of cost it would take to do source separation versus go through depackaging. And if there was any type of cost analysis, if the loss of recycled materials were factored into any of your models.
No, that would be a very expensive study to do. And while we would love to have that data available, the funds um, for such research are not available in my state. My state is quite strapped at the state level for cash at the moment. So that could happen through dedicated funding, if there were dedicated funding that came through, or there was third party investment in our state, but those kinds of funds are just not available to us at this time.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can echo that. That kind of research would likely be something covered under our Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service. But I think ultimately when they do get the grant funding, they have to be very particular about what they choose to spend that funding on.
Yeah, Vermont hasn't done any analysis like that either.
Um, this is a great question for all three of our regulators. From a regulatory perspective, I think it's a source separation organics compared to depackaging. What evidence would you need to decide whether one approach better protects end product quality without unnecessarily restricting organics diversion?
It's a great question, and it's a complicated one, actually, but good exercise to run through. Um, I mean, I think from my standpoint, and just thinking off the top of my head, I think it would depend on being able to sample and measure different constituents that might be present in the end products, digestates, composts, etc. And then beyond that, it's one step further, right? It's like, what impact does that have in the environment or the public health if the compost is applied to veggie gardens at someone's house? So there's almost a public health or an environmental analysis component to it. So it's a long ways away, I think, to be able to connect those dots in a meaningful way from a regulatory standpoint, at least how Vermont works with, our partner agencies at the Agency of Ag and the Department of Health. But that's kind of how I would think that through in a nutshell from where I sit.
Here's a quick one. Am I correct that for certified organic compost or for a certified organic compost supplier, depackaging is still a no?
I'm sorry, Paula, could you say that again?
Yeah. Someone asked, is it correct that for a composter that is certified organic that is a certified organic supplier, depackaging is still a no.
I I think typically you wouldn't see, well, that's not necessarily true because I think in California there are composters who make a compost that's listed for use in organic agriculture do have depackaging.
Mhm.
Um, so I'd say it's probably situational um, versus a yes or a no.
And in my state, our environmental regulatory agency is not the same agency that does organic certification. So I can't speak to those requirements at all. That's our Department of Agriculture.
Mhm. A question coming in is for our regulators. How do we create standards or regulations that promote depackaging in a way that unlocks previously unreachable feedstocks, but ensures that we don't return to mixed waste composting like we saw in the 80s?
I'm gonna speak from my state because my state is very far along on the composting road compared to some states. We have very robust collection for composting, and composting has been steadily growing over time. And there is a need for composting for all of the material that we are generating that is going to contain yard debris, wood waste, etc., because that's just not going to go through a depackaging system. What we so in our state, our demand for composting, just to be able to capture the material that's out there, is driving growth. We are still seeing more um, compost facilities being planned and built. And then on the other side of that, we have these mandates for collection of food waste. And unfortunately, in our state, we have very, very filthy food waste streams already without even considering requirements to manually open packaging or go through mechanical depackaging. We have a lot of material generated front of the house through restaurants, through multifamily, and a lot of other streams that are just already very, very contaminated. And so we know that composters are going to need and anaerobic digesters, they're going to need to have a way of getting that contamination out. And which path is best, I think, is going to depend upon the kind of streams that you're generating, how you're collecting it, whether you're collecting food waste commingled with yard debris in the same truck, whether you're not, whether you have, dedicated services, whether you're trying to generate biogas. And as a state that has a lot of infrastructure, a lot of facilities, a lot of collection already, and then these mandates for additional 4 million additional tons of collection over the next decade. And we are very shy of having that capacity. So we're a lot more like California, even though we're a much smaller state than California. We're a much larger state than some of the others as far as population, and organics will have to be managed. So, we're just trying to ensure that with these mandates for collection, that there's some place for it to go, honestly. And so for us, depackaging and anaerobic digestion look like a very good option for certain streams.
If I have time to add something else, I just want to say that I'm really, really glad that someone brought up that mixed recycling, because I think that there's an opportunity to not make some of those same mistakes and learning from the past and what already worked or did not work. And I think that one of the solutions is going to be through that optimizing recycling because that's going to involve some level of not just throwing everything together. If we're putting some of those end materials on a higher priority beyond just the food that we're trying to recover.
Can can I just ask a quick question of the BioCycle folks? Turn it around here at the end. Is there a way that, and I don't want to put the other panelists on the spot, but is there a way that we could get the Q&A role to us? I'd like to answer the folks' questions that we might not have time to do today, at least in writing from the Vermont perspective, because it seemed like there was a lot of interest that we just don't have time to get to.
I know this should have been a 2-hour panel. There's lots of questions, lots of great questions, and I saw some come through the chat. I was reading from the Q&A panel, so apologies if I missed your questions. I think we are 1 minute over time. What I might suggest is I've downloaded the chats, so I can send that to our panelists, and maybe it becomes a series on BioCycle, or each agency can answer the questions like from their perspective. I so appreciate Ben, Lauren, Don Marie, Juliana, Nora. Thank you for being part of today's panel and discussion, our inaugural webinar, not too shabby. To all of our guests, thank you for tuning in and hearing this discussion on regulations around depackaging. This is a topic that BioCycle has been involved in for a number of years and will continue to be involved in. So I appreciate each one of your thoughts, comments, and sharing your insights from your experiences as regulators and as researchers on this topic. Thanks.
Thank
Take
you
care
all.
all.
Bye-bye.